It was a cold morning in December 1773 when the faint smell of tea lingered over the Boston harbor, mixing with the salty tang of the sea. But the tea wasn't just tea, and the harbor wasn't just a harbor. That morning, hidden beneath layers of cold fog and quiet streets, a rebellion was brewing, one that would ripple across the American colonies and change the course of history forever. Few realized it then, but the sparks of resistance that glimmered in the eyes of ordinary men and women would ignite a fire that even kings and empires could not extinguish. Chapter 1: The Seeds of Rebellion. In the heart of Boston, cobblestone streets echoed with the clatter of horse hooves and the murmur of citizens discussing news from afar. Among them was Samuel Thompson, a young printer's apprentice with a restless curiosity and a burning sense of justice. His hands, stained with ink and calloused from labor, held more than just letters. They held the stories of people who could not speak for themselves. He had witnessed the growing tension between the colonies and the British Crown, felt it in the whispers of merchants, the angry mutterings of farmers, and the furtive conversations in taverns where a candle flickered against the shadows of tyranny. The year was 1770, and the colonies were on edge. The British Parliament had passed a series of taxes on paper, paint, and tea that the colonists saw as unjust and oppressive. It wasn't the price that angered them, but the principle: taxation without representation. Men like Samuel knew that if these policies were left unchallenged, they threatened not only their livelihoods, but the very idea of liberty itself. It was in the taverns, among the smoke of pipes and the clink of mugs, that the first true murmurs of rebellion took shape. Samuel listened to stories of violence against townsfolk by British soldiers, of homes ransacked under the guise of law, and of merchants struggling to survive under the weight of oppressive taxes. These stories were passed quietly, like contraband, from one citizen to another, until they became an unspoken pact. Something had to be done. By 1773, tensions had reached a boiling point. News of the Tea Act had arrived from London, granting the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. To Samuel and countless others, it was more than an economic threat. It was a symbol of domination, an affront to the fragile liberties the colonists had fought so hard to preserve. On the night of December 16th, Samuel stood along the dimly lit wharves of Boston Harbor. He watched as men dressed as Mohawk Indians crept silently toward the ships, their movements precise, almost ritualistic. Barrels of tea, carefully stacked and guarded, seemed insignificant compared to the audacity of the act itself. When the first barrel cracked open and tea splashed into the icy waters, Samuel felt a thrill unlike any he had known. This was not just protest, this was defiance. This was history in motion. But behind the triumph, a more complex story unfolded, of spies and double agents, of ordinary people risking everything for a cause greater than themselves. Samuel would soon discover that the path to freedom was paved not only with courage, but with secrecy, betrayal, and moments that would test the very limits of loyalty. In the months that followed, Samuel's life became entwined with figures who would become legendary. Paul Revere, whose midnight ride carried the warning of impending war. Abigail Adams, whose letters would challenge the ideals of men in power. And Benjamin Franklin, the wily diplomat whose cunning would outmaneuver kings. Together, these lives wove a tapestry of struggle, sacrifice, and hope that would define the birth of a nation.
Chapter 2: Whispers and Shadows. The winter of 1774 arrived with an icy grip over Boston. Snow dusted the cobblestones like powdered sugar, but beneath the picturesque streets lay a city simmering with unrest. Samuel Thompson, now more than a printer's apprentice, had become an informal messenger for the growing network of patriots. His days were spent at the press, churning out pamphlets filled with fiery rhetoric, and his nights were spent carrying letters through the narrow alleys, letters that could ignite revolt or cost him his life. Samuel's newest assignment came from a man he had only recently met in a crowded tavern, Jonathan Hale, a sharp-eyed merchant with a talent for reading both people and politics. Hale's request was simple on paper, but dangerous in execution. Deliver a series of coded letters to contacts in New York, Philadelphia, and beyond. These letters detailed strategies for non-violent resistance against British authorities, boycotts, petitions, and the careful planning of demonstrations. But in the shadows, spies lurked, ready to intercept any hint of rebellion. Samuel's journey took him through the winding streets of Boston, where every corner seemed to whisper with the presence of informants. He could feel the tension in the air, as if the city itself was holding its breath. By day, loyalists patrolled the streets, their red coats gleaming against the gray winter skies. By night, patriots like Samuel moved like ghosts, unseen but determined. One evening, after delivering a particularly sensitive letter, Samuel found himself cornered by a British soldier near King's Chapel. The man's eyes were sharp, scanning the papers clutched in Samuel's hands. For a moment, fear froze him. Then, instinct took over. Samuel tossed the envelope into the snow, letting it disappear into the swirling wind, and feigned ignorance. "Just heading home, sir," he said, voice steady. The soldier studied him for a heartbeat, then moved on. Samuel exhaled, the adrenaline still thrumming in his veins. Each close call reminded him of the stakes. One misstep, and not only his life, but the lives of countless others would be at risk. Back at the press, Samuel continued to churn out pamphlets and newsletters that spread the ideas of liberty. He printed stories of the Boston Tea Party, stories of men and women who dared to stand against a powerful empire. Each pamphlet was filled with names, dates, and facts that the British tried to suppress, creating a historical record that would live long after the ink had dried. But Samuel was not alone. Across the colonies, others were playing their parts in the unfolding drama. In Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin negotiated with foreign powers, laying the groundwork for international support. In Virginia, George Washington trained militias, preparing for a war that seemed inevitable. And in Boston, Samuel's friends and neighbors, shopkeepers, artisans, teachers, risked their livelihoods to ensure that the message of resistance would not be silenced. It was in these quiet acts of courage that the true story of the revolution was being written, not in the grand halls of power, nor in the battlefields alone, but in the whispers of ordinary people, moving unseen, determined to forge a future that belonged to them. Samuel often wondered if those who came after would understand the weight of what they were doing, the small sacrifices, the fear, the unrelenting hope. He hoped they would. By the spring of 1775, Boston was a powder keg. Every day brought new confrontations between colonists and soldiers. Samuel could feel the tension coiling tighter, ready to explode. The letters he carried, the pamphlets he printed, and the secrets he protected were all pieces of a larger story, one that was about to erupt into a conflict that would reshape the world.
Chapter 3. The First Shots. April 1775 arrived with a chill that cut through Boston like a blade. The city was restless. Whispers of armed conflict had begun to dominate every conversation. Samuel Thompson, now seasoned in secrecy and subterfuge, sensed that the fragile peace was about to shatter. The British, aware of the colonists' growing defiance, had moved troops into the countryside to seize arms and ammunition stored by militias in towns like Concord. Samuel had spent weeks delivering messages between Boston patriots and the committees of correspondence in surrounding towns. Every trip was fraught with danger. Horses could falter, letters could be intercepted, and loyalist spies were everywhere. But Samuel's mission went beyond mere communication. He was helping to coordinate resistance, ensuring that townsfolk were prepared for whatever might come. On the night of April 18th, news reached Boston that the British were advancing toward Lexington. Samuel, along with Paul Revere and William Dawes, prepared to alert the countryside. Lanterns flashed from the Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea. Samuel mounted his horse, heart pounding, and galloped through the dark streets. The air was tense, thick with the smell of wet earth and anticipation. Every shadow seemed alive with danger, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. By dawn, the countryside was awake with the sound of drums and whispered warnings. Samuel reached Lexington Green just as the first Minutemen assembled. Faces he had seen only in taverns and printing shops were now resolute with purpose. Among them stood John Parker, the militia captain, whose calm authority belied the tension in the air. Samuel handed out the final messages, urging coordination and vigilance. Then came the shots. No one could say who fired first. The crack of musket fire shattered the morning stillness, and men fell on both sides. Chaos erupted, and Samuel found himself in the middle of history. He ducked behind a fence, firing his musket of the advancing redcoats when necessary, then sprinting to deliver urgent messages to neighboring towns. Every second felt eternal. Every decision carried the weight of life or death. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of the Revolutionary War. For Samuel, they were more than battles. They were a confirmation of everything he had feared and hoped for. The colonies were no longer debating oppression in quiet taverns. They were rising, armed and determined. In the weeks that followed, Samuel continued his dangerous work, traveling between towns, helping to coordinate militias, and ensuring that intelligence reached the right hands. He met other patriots along the way, men like Ethan Allen, whose daring Green Mountain Boys were making headlines in Vermont, and Benedict Arnold, whose early victories were inspiring the weary colonists. Amid the turmoil, Samuel also discovered the shadows that accompanied rebellion. Loyalists were everywhere, hiding in plain sight. Some were neighbors, some were distant acquaintances, and some were even friends who had chosen loyalty to the crown over liberty. Samuel learned to trust carefully, to read not just faces but gestures, tones, and silences. One wrong move could cost lives, and yet the risk was worth it. By summer 1775, the siege of Boston had begun. Patriot militias surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and preparing for a protracted struggle. Samuel watched as ordinary men became soldiers, teachers became tacticians, and printers like him became chroniclers of a revolution. Each day, he wrote letters, printed pamphlets, and carried intelligence, knowing that the smallest detail could tip the balance between victory and defeat. And yet, even as the Patriots gained momentum, Samuel could feel the war expanding beyond Boston. He knew this was no longer a local struggle. It was the birth of a nation. Every town, every citizen, every act of defiance was part of a story that would be told for centuries. Samuel Thompson, a young printer with ink-stained hands, had become a witness, a participant, and ultimately, a guardian of history itself.
Chapter 4: Shadows and Alliances. By late 1775, the Revolutionary War had spread beyond Boston, reaching New York, New Jersey, and the distant frontier towns of Pennsylvania and Virginia. Samuel Thompson had traveled hundreds of miles in service of the cause, carrying letters, intelligence, and sometimes hope itself. Each journey was a tightrope walk between courage and disaster. One misstep could cost him his life, or worse, compromise the fragile network of patriots that stretched across the colonies. Samuel had learned the art of observation. Every inn he visited, every carriage he rode, every handshake and glance was carefully analyzed. Loyalists and spies were everywhere, embedded in towns and cities, reporting back to British authorities. Yet the Patriots had their own shadows, the invisible couriers, the code makers, the agents who could move undetected, passing information from Boston to Philadelphia and beyond.
Samuel had become one of these invisible threads, weaving a web of communication that could tip the scales in battles yet to come. In Philadelphia, Samuel finally met Benjamin Franklin, whose reputation as a diplomat and thinker preceded him. Franklin, older and calmer than the fiery young patriot Samuel had known in Boston, regarded him with a keen eye. "Information," Franklin said, "is as potent as gunpowder. Handle it carefully, or it will burn your hands." Samuel nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility. The letters he carried weren't just words, they were plans, warnings, and instructions that could alter the outcome of battles, cities, even the war itself. Meanwhile, across the colonies, political and military leaders wrestled with a question that would define history: independence. The Continental Congress debated fiercely, balancing the risk of open rebellion against the desire for liberty. Figures like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson argued passionately for separation from the crown, while others feared the repercussions of declaring war against one of the world's most powerful empires. Samuel, through his connections and intelligence work, found himself at the edge of these debates, not as a politician, but as a man who could ensure that the Patriots' plans moved unseen and uninterrupted. By the spring of 1776, the revolutionary cause reached a turning point. Samuel traveled from town to town, delivering messages about troop movements, British reinforcements, and strategic alliances with foreign sympathizers. He witnessed firsthand the training of militias, the building of fortifications, and the ingenuity of men and women determined to fight against overwhelming odds. It was also during this time that Samuel became involved in a more clandestine effort: espionage. Working with a network of patriots in New York and New Jersey, he helped pass intelligence about British troop movements to leaders like George Washington. Messages were hidden in books, sewn into clothing, or carried in seemingly innocent containers: a loaf of bread, a satchel of letters, even a baby's cradle. Samuel's nerves were constantly tested, and the line between bravery and recklessness blurred with each assignment. Then came the most extraordinary moment of Samuel's life: the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. He was in Philadelphia when Thomas Jefferson's words were first read aloud in secret committees, and he felt the tremor of history beneath his feet. Jefferson's vision, Adams' passion, and Franklin's wisdom converged on a single principle: liberty was not a privilege, it was a right. Samuel knew that the next steps would be dangerous. The British Empire would not simply accept a breakaway colony. The war would escalate, and countless lives, including his own, hung in the balance. Yet Samuel also understood something else. The fight for independence was no longer just about rebellion. It was about identity, unity, and the birth of a nation. Every letter he delivered, every secret he preserved, every small act of courage contributed to a cause far greater than himself. And as he looked out over the streets of Philadelphia, filled with whispers of hope and revolution, he realized that history was not written by kings or generals alone. It was written by the countless ordinary people who dared to defy oppression and imagine a free world.
Chapter 5: The Birth of a Nation. July 1776 arrived with a heat that seemed to make the streets of Philadelphia shimmer, but the city's energy was not merely a product of summer, it was the fever of history in motion. Samuel Thompson walked the narrow alleys, feeling the pulse of revolution in every footstep. The Declaration of Independence had just been officially adopted by the Continental Congress, and the city was alive with whispers of freedom, fear, and defiance. Samuel had been present during the private readings of Jefferson's draft, carrying notes and letters between the delegates, ensuring that communications to other colonies remained uninterrupted. He had witnessed the spark of something extraordinary: men and women daring to imagine a world where liberty was more than a dream. Now, that dream was public, and the consequences were immediate. British forces, enraged by the news, began mobilizing to crush the fledgling nation before it could solidify.
Samuel's work grew more dangerous by the day. New York was under threat, and he was tasked with carrying intelligence about troop positions, supply movements, and Loyalist sympathizers. Disguised as a traveling merchant, he moved between towns, his satchel filled with coded messages and maps that could alter the outcome of battles. One evening, in a dimly lit inn near the Hudson River, Samuel narrowly avoided capture when a British officer questioned him about his papers. Calmly, he produced a ledger of business transactions while concealing the real documents within its pages. The officer glanced at him suspiciously, but Samuel's nerves and quick thinking allowed him to slip away, carrying the fragile hope of the revolution with him. Meanwhile, the war itself escalated. The battles of Long Island, Trenton, and Princeton tested the resolve of both soldiers and civilians. Samuel traveled alongside militias, delivering orders, gathering intelligence, and sometimes even assisting in the coordination of supply lines. He saw the courage of ordinary men who, against all odds, stood their ground against one of the most formidable armies in the world. He witnessed moments of despair and triumph, from the freezing night march across the Delaware River to the exhilaration of a hard-fought victory at Princeton. But Samuel also saw the cost of war: homes burned, families displaced, and friends lost. He wrote letters to the families of fallen soldiers, carrying their grief and honor in his ink-stained hands. It was a time when personal sacrifice intertwined with the fate of a nation, and Samuel began to understand that liberty was not free. It demanded courage, endurance, and sometimes unimaginable suffering. Amid the battles, Samuel encountered foreign allies that would shape the course of the revolution. French officers offered military expertise, while diplomats from Europe provided critical support and supplies. Samuel, though a printer and courier by trade, found himself interacting with generals and envoys, bridging the gap between intelligence and strategy. He began to realize that the American Revolution was not merely a local struggle, it was a global event, a moment that would resonate far beyond the borders of the colonies. As 1777 approached, Samuel reflected on how far the colonies had come. What had begun as whispers in taverns and printed pamphlets had become a full-scale fight for independence. Samuel's role, though often invisible, had been vital. Every letter he carried, every plan he delivered, every warning he whispered in the dark had shaped the course of history. And yet, he knew the greatest challenges were still ahead. Battles loomed in New York, Philadelphia, and beyond. The British were relentless, the war was far from over, and the fragile hope of independence remained under constant threat. But Samuel Thompson, once a young printer with ink-stained hands, had become something more: a witness to history, a participant in the birth of a nation, and a symbol of the countless ordinary people whose courage and resolve would define the United States of America.
Chapter 6: Fire and Ice. The winter of 1777 descended upon the colonies like a living threat. Valley Forge, just outside Philadelphia, became a crucible of endurance, courage, and desperation. Samuel Thompson arrived there in late December, weary from weeks of travel, but driven by duty. He had carried letters, maps, and intelligence across miles of snow-covered terrain, often evading British patrols and Loyalist informants. The sight that greeted him at Valley Forge was both inspiring and haunting. Ragged soldiers huddled in makeshift huts, their faces etched with exhaustion, hunger, and unwavering determination. General George Washington, standing amid the frost and biting wind, epitomized calm authority. Samuel had met the general before, carrying sensitive dispatches, but seeing him here, in the heart of suffering, was profoundly humbling. Washington's gaze swept across the camp, noting every detail, every need, every small victory and morale. Samuel realized that leadership was not merely strategy, it was the quiet, relentless commitment to people who depended on you for their very survival.
Samuel's work at Valley Forge went beyond intelligence. He assisted in coordinating supply lines, delivering letters to distant militias, and ensuring communication between officers who were scattered across the harsh winter landscape. Disease, starvation, and frostbite were as deadly as enemy bullets, and Samuel witnessed soldiers succumbing to conditions that tested both body and spirit. Yet, amid the suffering, moments of humanity shone through. A shared piece of bread, a song around a fire, a whispered story from home that reminded men what they were fighting for. By spring 1778, the tides of the war began to shift. Samuel traveled to New York and New Jersey carrying news of the crucial Franco-American alliance. The French, having recognized the American cause, brought soldiers, ships, and supplies that would alter the balance of power. Samuel marveled at the international dimension of the conflict. The American Revolution had become a world stage, with every courier, every letter, and every strategy woven into a complex web of global politics. Samuel also found himself entwined in intelligence missions of growing importance. British forces, aware of the value of information, sought to infiltrate and disrupt the Patriots' networks. Samuel learned to use codes, ciphers, and secret signals. Letters were hidden in everyday objects, inside candle molds, sewn into clothing, or concealed within hollowed-out books. One mission nearly ended in disaster when a loyalist spy intercepted him near Trenton, but Samuel's quick thinking and knowledge of the terrain allowed him to escape into the snowy night, carrying critical dispatches that would influence troop movements and supply chains. As 1779 and 1780 unfolded, the war spread to the southern colonies. Samuel traveled to Virginia and the Carolinas, witnessing the fierce guerrilla tactics employed by militias in the devastating retaliation of British forces. Towns were burned, civilians displaced, and countless lives disrupted. Yet amid chaos, Samuel also observed courage in its rawest form. Ordinary farmers taking up arms, women tending to soldiers and wounded, and leaders like Nathaniel Greene and Francis Marion turning desperate circumstances into tactical advantage. Through it all, Samuel kept a journal, chronicling not just the battles and strategies, but the human stories that would later define the revolution. He wrote of bravery and betrayal, hope and despair, courage and sacrifice. His accounts captured the full spectrum of what it meant to fight for freedom far beyond the battlefield. By 1781, as the war drew towards its climax at Yorktown, Samuel realized something extraordinary. The revolution was not merely a military struggle, it was the forging of a nation's identity built upon the sacrifices of countless individuals whose names would never be remembered in history books, but whose courage had been no less vital. Samuel Thompson, once a young printer from Boston, had become a living witness to the birth of America, a man whose role in the shadows helped shape the destiny of a fledgling nation.
Chapter 7: Victory at Yorktown. The fall of 1781 brought a tension unlike anything Samuel Thompson had ever felt. News had arrived that British General Cornwallis had entrenched his forces at Yorktown, Virginia, awaiting reinforcements. Samuel had traveled from New Jersey, carrying critical intelligence between Washington's headquarters and Allied French commanders. Every mile of the journey was perilous. Roads were patrolled by loyalists and British scouts, and even the smallest misstep could result in capture or death. Yet Samuel's determination never wavered. He knew that the fate of the revolution and the birth of a new nation hung in the balance. Samuel arrived in Yorktown as the American and French armies began to surround the British forces. The combined forces of Washington and French General Rochambeau moved with precision, and Samuel's letters had played a silent but crucial role in coordinating troop movements, supply chains, and artillery placements. For the first time, Samuel saw the enormous scale of a battle shaped by careful strategy rather than raw chaos. Thousands of soldiers, cannons, and ships converged, their collective purpose clear: to end the British occupation once and for all. The siege of Yorktown was grueling. Samuel moved between observation points, relaying messages, mapping troop positions, and delivering intelligence under the cover of night. Smoke and cannon fire filled the air. The ground trembled with each explosion. Samuel witnessed soldiers' valor firsthand, men fighting not just for survival, but for the ideals they had carried in their hearts for years. He wrote detailed notes of the battle, aware that these observations might serve as the historical record for generations to come. After weeks of bombardment and maneuvering, Cornwallis found himself trapped. On October 19, 1781, he formally surrendered his army to Washington. The moment was electric. Samuel stood among the patriots, tears frozen on his cheeks by the crisp autumn air, feeling the weight of years of struggle finally lift. Victory had been achieved, not through luck, but through strategy, resilience, and the unyielding courage of ordinary people who had dared to believe in something greater than themselves. In the aftermath, Samuel moved among the celebrations with a quiet pride. Soldiers sang and danced, women wept with relief, and families reunited. Yet Samuel's mind lingered on the cost. Thousands of lives lost, homes destroyed, and communities shattered. He knew freedom was not simply the absence of British soldiers, it was the responsibility of the people to preserve, nurture, and defend it. Samuel returned to Boston in late 1782, witnessing a city transformed by the war. The cobblestones he had once hurried across now carried the memory of battles, whispered conversations, and clandestine missions. He resumed his work at the press, chronicling the stories of the Revolution, recording names, dates, and events for a new generation. His writings captured the essence of the struggle: courage, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of liberty. By 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially recognized American independence. Samuel, standing along the harbor where the Boston Tea Party had begun years earlier, reflected on the journey. From printed pamphlets to coded letters, from skirmishes to major battles, he had been a witness and participant in a historic transformation. He realized that the revolution was not the work of generals alone, nor the decisions of Congress. It was the sum of countless small actions, choices made in secrecy and shadow, by people willing to risk everything for the promise of freedom. Samuel Thompson's story, though rooted in a single individual, represented the spirit of an entire nation. Ordinary men and women, soldiers, couriers, printers, farmers, and families had forged the United States through courage, intelligence, and unyielding hope. And as he watched the sun set over Boston Harbor, Samuel knew that the history he had lived, recorded, and shaped would endure far beyond his lifetime, a testament to the power of ordinary people to change the course of the world.
Chapter 8: A Nation Reborn. The guns had fallen silent, but the work of building a nation had only begun. Samuel Thompson returned to Boston in 1783, stepping into a city both familiar and profoundly changed. The streets he had once traversed as a courier, a printer, and a messenger now carried the weight of history. Buildings bore scars from the war, yet the air was thick with hope and possibility. Independence had been won, but freedom, Samuel knew, required far more than victory on the battlefield. It demanded governance, justice, and unity among a people once divided. Samuel resumed his work at the press, but his purpose had evolved. He was no longer simply printing pamphlets or carrying secret letters. He now chronicled the birth of a nation. His presses produced newspapers detailing the creation of the Articles of Confederation, debates in state conventions, and the arduous work of forming a central government. He published essays promoting civic responsibility, recounting heroic tales from the war, and inspiring citizens to engage with the new democracy. Samuel understood that history needed to be recorded accurately, not as propaganda, but as a living testament to the sacrifices and courage of ordinary people. The post-war years were fraught with challenges. Economic instability, social unrest, and political division threatened the fragile republic. Samuel observed men like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson debating tirelessly in Philadelphia, shaping a constitution that balanced power and liberty. He carried letters and intelligence between state representatives, aware that even small errors or delays could influence debates that would determine the nation's future. Every citizen, he realized, had a role in the nation's survival, not only soldiers in the field, but writers, thinkers, and messengers like himself. Samuel also witnessed the struggles of veterans returning home. Many faced poverty, injury, and the emotional scars of war. He recorded their stories in pamphlets and newspapers, emphasizing the responsibility of the new government to honor their service. At the same time, loyalists who had fled or remained in the colonies were reintegrated, creating tension that required diplomacy, patience, and careful negotiation. Samuel understood that the revolution was not merely a war against the British, it was a process of transforming society, healing wounds, and forging a shared identity. Amid these national challenges, Samuel found moments of personal fulfillment. He married Elizabeth Hartley, the daughter of a local merchant who had supported the Patriot cause. Together, they raised a family, instilling in their children the values of civic duty, integrity, and resilience. Samuel also mentored young printers and scribes, passing on his knowledge of letters, codes, and communication. He encouraged them to record history, reminding them that every ordinary action, every written word, and every act of courage contributed to the story of America. By the mid-1780s, Samuel had become a respected figure in Boston. Though he had never sought fame or recognition, his role in the Revolution was quietly acknowledged by veterans, political leaders, and citizens alike. He had witnessed the birth of a nation, survived its darkest hours, and contributed to the foundations of its enduring legacy. Yet he remained humble, always mindful that history was written not by a single man, but by the collective courage of countless ordinary individuals. In 1787, as the Constitutional Convention debated the principles that would guide the United States for centuries, Samuel reflected on the journey he had lived. From the secret letters of 1773 to the cannon fire at Yorktown, from the cold nights at Valley Forge to the bustling debates in Philadelphia, he had seen firsthand the triumphs and trials of liberty. The nation was no longer an idea whispered in taverns. It was real, fragile, and in need of stewardship. Samuel understood that freedom, once won, demanded vigilance, education, and the participation of every citizen. As he walked along Boston Harbor one evening, watching the waves shimmer in the fading light, Samuel thought of the generations to come. The city, the colonies, the nation, they were living testaments to courage, sacrifice, and vision. And though his own story was just one thread in a vast tapestry, he knew it mattered. Every career, every pamphlet, every act of quiet bravery had built a foundation for a free America. Samuel Thompson, printer, messenger, spy, and witness to history, had seen liberty born from the ordinary courage of extraordinary people. And in that knowledge, he found peace, pride, and an enduring hope for the nation he had helped shape.
Chapter 9: Legacy of the Ordinary. By the early 1790s, Samuel Thompson had settled into a quieter life, though the echoes of war never left him. Boston had changed dramatically. Streets were rebuilt, trade had resumed, and the once tense harbor now thrummed with merchants and ships from around the world. The city bore the scars of the Revolution, yet it stood as a testament to endurance, courage, and the collective effort of its citizens. Samuel continued his work as a printer, but now his press focused on education, history, and civic engagement. He published first-hand accounts of the Revolution, letters from soldiers, and essays promoting the principles that had inspired the fight for independence. Parents used his pamphlets to teach their children about liberty. Citizens studied them to understand the responsibilities of freedom. Samuel's work ensured that the story of the revolution, its sacrifices, strategies, and moral lessons would endure far beyond the lifetimes of those who had fought. He often visited veterans, many of whom struggled with poverty, injury, or the emotional toll of the war. Samuel advocated for public support and recognition, emphasizing that the sacrifices of ordinary people were as critical as the victories of generals. He wrote detailed accounts of battles, intelligence operations, and the personal stories of couriers, spies, and farmers who had risked everything for freedom. In doing so, he preserved the truth of the revolution, that liberty was not solely forged in the halls of Congress, but in the quiet bravery of countless individuals. Samuel also witnessed the political maturation of the United States. The Constitution had been ratified, establishing a framework of government that balanced liberty and law. He watched as the first presidents took office, navigating the challenges of a fledgling nation. Samuel understood that independence was only the beginning. The real test of a nation was how it governed itself, honored its promises, and protected the rights of its citizens. Amid these civic duties, Samuel found personal joy. He and Elizabeth raised their children with stories of courage and responsibility. He encouraged them to think critically, to serve their communities, and to value the sacrifices that had made their lives possible. Samuel often walked along the harbor, reflecting on the years of struggle, danger, and perseverance. From the Boston Tea Party to the battles of New York and Yorktown, from coded letters and shadowed alleys to the fires of patriotism in every tavern and home, Samuel understood that history was not the work of a single man. It was the accumulation of small, extraordinary acts by ordinary people. In his later years, Samuel became a mentor to young historians, printers, and civic leaders. He emphasized the importance of memory, truth, and the power of storytelling. Liberty, he told them, is fragile, and it is sustained by vigilance, courage, and ordinary people who are willing to do extraordinary things without seeking glory. His words inspired a generation, instilling a deep understanding of responsibility, citizenship, and the enduring cost of freedom. As the sun set over Boston Harbor, Samuel Thompson reflected on his life. He had witnessed the birth of a nation, survived the trials of war, and contributed in ways both visible and unseen. The revolution had not been a tale of kings or generals alone. It had been written in the letters of couriers, the ink of printers, and the sacrifices of citizens who believed in something greater than themselves. Samuel's story, intertwined with the story of the United States, became a testament to the extraordinary power of ordinary people. And though Samuel knew he would not live forever, he took comfort in the knowledge that the nation he had helped shape would endure, guided by the principles, courage, and vision of those who had fought, suffered, and hoped. In the quiet moments by the harbor, Samuel understood the truth that would echo through generations. Freedom was born not just in battles and declarations, but in the courage of ordinary people to dream, act, and persevere.
Chapter 10. Remembering the Fire. By the early 1800s, Samuel Thompson had grown old, though his spirit remained as sharp as the day he first carried a letter through Boston's narrow streets. The world around him had changed in ways both profound and subtle. The United States, once a fragile idea whispered in taverns and printed in secret pamphlets, was now a living, breathing nation. Towns thrived, trade flourished, and the principles of liberty, hard-won, fragile, and fiercely defended, were beginning to shape a unique American identity. Samuel spent his final years reflecting on the extraordinary journey he had lived. From the Boston Tea Party, where ordinary citizens defied imperial authority, to the icy nights of Valley Forge, to the triumph of Yorktown, he had witnessed the revolution in all its chaos, courage, and glory. Yet the most enduring lessons, Samuel realized, were not the battles or the strategies. They were the acts of ordinary people who dared to act even when fear, hunger, or doubt threatened to stop them. He often walked the streets of Boston, recalling the faces of men and women whose names might never appear in history books, but whose sacrifices had shaped the nation. Farmers who carried muskets alongside their plows, women who tended to soldiers and preserved vital intelligence, printers who spread the word of liberty. These were the true architects of the revolution. Samuel, a printer and messenger himself, felt honored to be among them, a witness and participant in a story far greater than any individual. Samuel's children and grandchildren would grow up hearing his tales, but he understood that the stories of courage and sacrifice were bigger than any one life. They belonged to the nation itself. And as he taught them, he reminded them that freedom was not a gift to be taken for granted. It demanded vigilance, participation, and the courage to act in the face of uncertainty. One evening, as the sun set over Boston Harbor, Samuel sat on a wooden bench where he had often paused during his secretive journeys years before. The harbor glimmered in gold and red, and he thought of the first barrel of tea that had sparked rebellion, of the soldiers who had endured the bitter cold of Valley Forge, of the muskets fired at Lexington and Concord, and of the jubilant cheers at Yorktown. He realized that history was alive in every street, every building, every wave of the harbor, a living memory of courage, struggle, and hope. Samuel Thompson closed his eyes and smiled, feeling a deep peace. He had lived through extraordinary times, seen the birth of a nation, and witnessed liberty forged in fire and ice. He had known fear, endured hardship, and carried messages that changed the course of history. And he learned that the revolution was not just about independence, it was about the spirit of a people who refused to accept oppression, who believed in justice, and who dared to dream of a free world. In the end, Samuel understood that his story and the stories of countless others would endure long after he was gone. The United States, imperfect but alive with the promise of liberty, carried forward the legacy of ordinary people who became extraordinary through courage and conviction. And in the quiet of the harbor, with the wind rustling the sails of ships and the last light of day reflecting on the water, Samuel Thompson knew that freedom, once born from the courage of many, would continue to burn, ever bright, for generations yet to come.